Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. My name is Rich Steve Beck. A huge welcome to Produce, Mix, Fix and Conquer. So if you're viewing us from our community, which is facebook.com/groups/produce, mix, fix and conquer, a huge hello. And if we've not met before, so great to meet you, and feel free to get involved. And also feel free to watch on our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/produce, mix, fix and conquer. If you've got any friends that you feel would benefit from this interview today, watching our amazing guest Peter coming up very shortly, then if they miss it, again, they can catch up on our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/produce, mix, fix and conquer. So we've got an amazing guest coming up. So Peter is a vinyl mastering engineer specialist. He works at the phenomenal studio, The Bakery. He's also trained up at Ocean Way in LA. He's also trained, well, he was at Metropolis for a good while in London as well, working with some phenomenal artists that are household names. So without further ado, let's invite Peter on. Hey, Peter, how you doing?
Hey, you caught me looking at my phone.
That's good. We're live. Hey, it's cool.
How you doing?
So good. How's LA over there at the minute? How's the weather?
Grey and smoggy. It's Judy Bloom has come early.
Oh, no way. So excited, but thank you so much for joining us today. Really excited to find out about your process and what it's like to be a vinyl mastering engineer specialist at The Bakery. And we've seen loads of pictures about The Bakery as well, and it looks phenomenal where you work. It's absolutely brilliant. So what we're going to do, if it's cool with yourself, we're going to start off by talking about your journey and how you got into music initially, and then have a chat about the studios that you've worked in and where you're at now, and also maybe have a chat about the gear that you use when you're doing your vinyl mastering, about your process, and maybe some of the plugins and the DAW that you use as well, if that's cool with you.
Sure.
Fantastic. Okay, so let's begin. So tell us at the very beginning of your story, what bands and artists were you getting into as a kid? What was your first taste of music from your parents?
Yeah, I was going to say his parents. Got my dad entirely to thank for this. When I was very young, he just gave me 3 tapes: the Red Album, the Blue Album, and Dark Side of the Moon.
Wow!
And I kind of wore those out, and they pretty much formed my sort of musical education, if you like. Kind of went from there into, I suppose, as you get into your early teens, you fall into whatever pop music people are listening to. And then I'm lucky enough to be of the generation where I sort of came into my teen years in the 90s. So then it was Oasis, Blur, those kind of bands that took over. But, oh yeah, I always still listen to the old stuff as well. Those albums that I got as a kid, well, I now own them, I suppose. So yeah, still play them very regularly.
Amazing. I know we've talked before, I think a week or two ago, that you're a big Oasis fan as well. So have you got the whole back catalogue, or you're not far off?
Back in the day, I was the ultimate fanboy. It was me and my mate who used to sort of collect up all the bootlegs and find all the obscure tracks that weren't released on things and that kind of thing. So yeah, I'd probably pretty much got them all somewhere, buried deep in piles of CDs at home now.
Fantastic. And what was the first CD or tape that you ever bought as a kid with your own money?
Well, I did was vinyl.
Oh, right, okay.
Well, again, my dad was he was a big vinyl collector, and so all my first experiences of listening to music, say apart from the ones he'd give me on tape, to my bedroom, it was all him putting records on. So I think the first ones I bought went to Lincoln Market and bought Thriller and Bad on LP, £5 each, I think they were.
Wow. Amazing.
Absolutely brilliant. Both of them somewhere. I know where the Thriller one is. I'm not sure where the Bad one is.
I remember with my dad, it's like we went had my first taste of music. I think it was I don't think it exists anymore, a place called Andy's Records that was knocking around. I think it was all over the UK. But the bargain bin was always the place to go, kind of if you found like random bands as a kid with some pocket money. It was great.
Yeah. The 99p bins next to the tills.
Yeah, absolutely. So tell us. So we talked off camera slightly about this before we began the interview. But did you pick up any instruments before you got into audio and before you got into mastering?
Very little. I mean, again, being child of the 90s, you kind of pick up a guitar trying to play Wonderwall like everyone did at the time.
Yeah.
But I don't think it ever went any further than that, really. I never really had an affinity for actually playing music. Always loved music, obviously, but never had an affinity for playing any instruments. Tried a few here and there. Played the keys as a kid and the guitar, as saying, hit the drums a few times, but I've never been very good at any of them. I think as it progressed, it more became a case of learning about the instruments through playing them a bit to learn how to better work with them from the other side.
Absolutely. So
especially the drums. I mean, that was probably the only reason I really stuck at that for a bit of time, was I was learning so much about how to record them and how they were supposed to be treated and that kind of thing just by playing them. So, but yeah, I was never very good at it. It was more learning from an audio perspective what was going on.
Amazing. Yeah. So talk about the audio perspective. So how did you get into audio? Did you start off recording, producing, mastering?
Recording. It was brilliant. 4-track recording, mates in the garage, that kind of thing. Again, I'm sure it's the story of an awful lot of engineers. I'm probably at the tail end of the people who really got onto that kind of thing. Again, in the sort of probably the late 90s, we were starting to play around with that kind of stuff. Like 4-track tape machines, recording whatever mates were playing at the time.
Can you remember what the 4-track was?
No, I think there was a Yamaha we had. I can't really remember. We used to pinch them from school.
Oh, right.
So it was whatever they had. I really can't remember. And I think it kept kind of rotating as to what was working and what they had. So I think there was a few different ones we used to pinch, but yeah, whatever school had.
Awesome. I think with my school, it's our first tape deck that I recorded a friend on was a Tascam. I think back then it was Tascam, wasn't it? Like you said, like
there was probably a Tascam Porter Studio in there as well at some point. I can't remember. There was a few different models, and I remember a mate had one, a very early one that worked on compact flash, kind of must have been around 2000, 2002.
Yeah.
That was a bit of a step up.
Yeah, I remember actually
8 tracks on compact flash rather than 4 tracks on a hissy cassette.
Yeah, completely. It just makes a big difference as well, because I suppose you're moving from analog to digital as well. So yeah, with the audio quality. I remember a friend of mine, he recorded it's terrible punk band I was in with some friends at school. And what happened? And he had a mini disc player. We were like, wow, this is like, again, I was a kid, a teenager in the 90s. Yeah, they were great. Have you still got one? Still got one knocking around? Yeah.
I've still got my original deck. It's all my old hi-fi equipment made it over here. It's all sat under the bed, but it's all still there. And as far as I know, it all still works.
Amazing. But it was revolutionary back then, though, wasn't it? In the 90s, you know, it's got all the kids, late 90s, early noughties, that all the kids were using them. It's phenomenal. But yeah, so when did you start to think? When did your brain suddenly go, I want to do this as a career, and because I know that you went down the educational route, right?
Yeah.
Saying that?
I mean, educationally, I wasn't really looking at doing it. I was at school. I was doing A-level photography at the time, and I was really enjoying that, and I wanted to go down the route of doing sort of TV and film camera work, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So it was on a university open day, and you're sort of touring around, and they're showing you this, that, and the other, and here's the TV studio, and here's the radio studio we've got, and here's the recording studio we've got. And I don't know, something about that environment, it just set a light bulb off in my head. Just wasn't interested in the TV studio. I was far more interested in what he was saying about the recording studio. So yeah, then just started to sort of explore that further. Ended up doing that course. Which was then the University of Manchester. I think it's now it changed to the University of Chester while I was there. I think they're still Chester, I'm not sure. I did that course and did the internship as part of that. You do a 2nd-year internship as part of that degree. Yeah. And that was the Ocean Way connection.
That's incredible. It's such a journey. So maybe have a good chat about Ocean Way in a moment as well, before starting work at the other phenomenal studios that you worked at as well. But what fundamentals did you actually learn on the course initially? So did you learn lots of basics? Did you cover mixing, mastering, and recording, or was it just mainly mastering? Or
well, the course was called Commercial Music Production, so it was really directed at recording and mixing.
Yeah.
I can't even remember mastering being mentioned.
No.
To be honest, I think what I got out of it the most, and I've heard this from a few other people who were sort of in education at the same sort of time, it wasn't so much the actual course and what you were being taught and all that kind of stuff. It was more just being able to go and camp in the studios for a weekend and play with things.
Yeah.
And me and a couple of mates became the sort of notorious ones for block booking huge amounts of time in the studios over weekends. We became the sort of regulars on the midnight till 6 a.m. block that no one else wanted, that kind of thing.
Amazing.
So we just spent so much time in there, and we probably got a lot more out of that than the actual course. Not to like completely diss the lecturers or anything, but I think it's just experimentation, and the whole thing just then comes from experience, doesn't it? And I think that's true across all of the sort of specialties, if you like. We all develop into our specialties just through the experience. It's not through anyone particularly saying one thing to us. It's just through doing it over and over again for years. And I think, that essentially the foundation of that was just sitting in the studio, playing for hours and hours, working things out.
Amazing. So was it at that moment at university before you moved to Ocean Wave that you realized that you wanted to do specifically mastering, and even more specifically final mastering?
Mastering came very, very late.
Okay.
I kind of tried. I mean, you try your hand at everything, trying to work out what you're good at, where people are going to pay you, most importantly.
Yeah.
So I did bits of recording, bits of mixing, did some film work, did some theatre work, done bits of live sound. I got into mastering because a guy I know at a studio, I think he's in Derbyshire, somewhere around there.
Okay.
He just sent me an email one day, says, "Look, I know you're not a mastering engineer, but I need something doing on this. No one else can do it. Can you just have a look at it? You seem to understand it." Because I'd made it my point to try and be a good mix engineer to a mastering engineer, so kind of understand what they wanted and what the process was. He sent me that, I did that, and then he started sending more the next couple of weeks. So I thought, all right, well, this is the one I'm obviously good at. This is the one that someone is just repeatedly now sending work for.
Yeah.
At that point, I was already doing night reception at Metropolis.
Oh,
so
wow.
It became a case of, well, instead of bugging the studio staff, start bugging the mastering staff instead.
Yeah, and start learning. And how did that go when you were bugging all the stuff? How were those sessions?
I think I started bugging at the right time. There was almost an opening in the department. There was an awful lot of engineers in the Metropolis department at that point, and they didn't really have the assistant cover to keep everything moving quickly enough. So I think I just got interested in it at the right time for them to sort of say, okay, well, you can come through as assistant. So you start shadowing some of the engineers there, and obviously then it becomes like exponential learning curve that you start going on.
Yeah, absolutely. That's amazing. So was Ocean Wave the beginning of all that then? So did you go to Metropolis for a little bit first, or was it Ocean Wave before?
I say Ocean Wave was only for the internship. It was like 3 months, I think it was there in total.
Yeah.
I mean, and when you're in a place like that for that amount of time, you're just sort of absorbing information as much as you can.
Absolutely.
It's when Jack Joseph Puig had his big Studio A, where the ones you've seen in the photos with all the racks and racks and racks of outboard and the dining tables and the massive candles. I think his assistant said he had to light 120 candles in that room every morning.
Wow.
And then in Studio B at the time, they had Joni Mitchell mixing. So you're just absorbing as much as you can when you're around those kind of people at that very early stage in your career. You just sort of sit there, be quiet, and watch what people are doing. But then I suppose that definitely opens doors, just having that Ocean Wave name on your CV later. Although, I mean, Metropolis was just a case of, I was walking around London with a pile of CVs and a big smile saying, "Do you need anyone?" And Crystal, who was the day receptionist at Metropolis at the time, said, "We need a new night receptionist. Do you want it?"
Wow.
Yeah, I'm in. So you start doing the night reception, then you start talking to the people at the studio, and eventually you find the place you want to be. Me ended up being the mastering department, and eventually they sort of pull you through.
Fantastic. That's amazing. So what obviously Metropolis, world famous studio, and what gear did you start learning on when you was at Metropolis? So what sort of outboard pieces did you watch and use? What DAW was you using? The speakers?
They've got very standardized rooms over there.
Okay.
The idea when Metropolis was founded was that the engineers would be able to switch between rooms. So they all started out very similar. They've been modified and tweaked over the years, but there's a base philosophy that covers all of the rooms there, and they all work through. Well, they did then anyway. Most of them were working through a Master mastering console then, and there was a couple of rooms that still had the custom-built ones that they built when they first opened in whenever it was, 92. I think a few of those, I think the remaining custom ones have died now. They were on their last legs when I was there, to be honest.
Right.
They were sort of just being kept. The ones that were still being used were just about being kept alive. It was getting to that stage with them. I think they've been changed to SPLs now. That I don't work there anymore, so I don't really know. But but the overall philosophy of how the rooms work is, they've got these central mastering console, analog mastering consoles with various bits of outboard. Most of the rooms have got a few standardized pieces of kit. They've got the Masterlek EQs that they've also customized there. They've got compressors from Masterlek. They've got Sontec synth EQs in most rooms there. But I don't think it's really the gear, to be honest. Anyway, it was more what I learned from the engineers.
Absolutely.
Especially the period of time that I was there was when an awful lot of people were moving from the analog mastering to doing purely in the box. There's at least 2 engineers there who, if it comes in digital, will very rarely take it analog. One never, one very rarely, and I'm sure a few of the others have moved in that same direction since. Because I know that here, I don't go analog very often, to be honest.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's all about staying digital, and that does go back to what the other thing you're asking though about the software, because it's Sadie. Metropolis is Sadie, and we're Sadie here as well. The big thing about Sadie is it's incredibly transparent. It doesn't mess with audio unless you absolutely ask it to. So that becomes a bigger part of what's going on than the outboard, I think.
Fantastic. So you're trying to get a linear master as possible. Would it be right in saying that? Is that the idea behind it?
I don't want to be doing anything to the sound that I don't want to do to the sound, essentially. So if you're using something like Pro Tools, it imparts a sound onto whatever you're doing, whether you want it to or not. Whereas Sadie doesn't really do that, and it's the same for the converters, both here and at Metropolis. Metropolis use the prisms, which I suppose they're slightly coloured, but they're incredibly musical and transparent at the same time. Here we've got JCF audio ones, which again are just incredibly transparent. Same sort of deal. So it's all about not doing anything that you don't want to do to it.
Absolutely. It's the converters. I mean, I'm still, I'm an amateur stage myself, transitioning into intermediate as a mastering engineer. But I mean, I'm using the RME ADI2 Pro FS, and to my ears, I did a few road tests, and that to my ears was pretty transparent. But I'd love to try like some of the Prism stuff and some of the Crane songs. So many cool AD to analog to digital to analog converters that are out there. But I suppose it's just having time to be able to go through them all. But have you tried a few as time's gone on?
Here and there, not a huge amount. I mean, I'm still a big fan of the Prism stuff, and we do use some Prism stuff here as well. The main converters that we use for the vinyl cutting and for mastering of the JCF ones, but we use Prism stuff in other places. The clocks in the Prism stuff is really good, so we use those in a few places. The only other one I really ever remember was while I was at Metropolis. They sent us a Lavery Gold to try out. We put it up against the Prism AD2. We fed a track into it. I think there was 3 of us in the room at the time. We played the tracks back and immediately put it back in the box and sent it back to them.
Wow, really?
It didn't. I don't know. To the 3 of us that were sat there listening to it, it didn't sound musical. It just sounded harsh and very brittle sounding, compared to the Prism, which just sounded sort of lush and, well, again, for want of a better phrase, musical.
Yeah, absolutely makes sense. You've got to You know, and if there's 3 engineers in the room at the same time, all kind of coming to the same conclusion, right? You must be, you know, onto something, and that absolutely makes sense.
And again, I don't want to sort of just say those Lavry's a rubbish converter or anything like that.
No, sure,
yeah,
no.
It could come down to just what we're used to and what we like the sound of.
Absolutely.
You know, we're very much used to the sound of the Prisms. I mean, one of the engineers who was in the room had been working on that Prism converter for the last 30 years at that point. So,
wow,
it's some of it is going to be a case of muscle memory, and I like the sound of this because it's what I know. But
yeah,
I don't know. To me, just that one time that someone sent through the great converter, it just didn't really stack up. Oh, actually, I think Antelope sent one through at once as well. I can't for the life of me remember what it was, but again, was equally unimpressed compared to the Prisms, to be honest.
Fair enough. And like you said there, every engineer's got a different pair of ears, and you know, it's all about perception rather than saying what's right or wrong. And
if we all worked the same, we'd all sound the same, and then none of us would have a job. So.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right. Yeah, completely. And it's fun. Gear is fun. It's fun to explore and try out new ideas. And but also as well, if you, like you said, you know, if you've been using the same system for 30 years, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. You know, that absolutely makes sense. Yeah, definitely. Speakers then at Metropolis, what speakers did you learn on, and what speakers did you end up using?
They've been PMC from day one. I think it's a long-standing deal.
Yeah.
They're fantastic. Yeah, they've got BB5s in most of the rooms. Spend most of my time working on those. And then here we're on the ATCs. We've got the 150s in the main room. That was an interesting transition, moving from one to the other, especially when you've been working on one for a good few years at that point. At least the first couple of weeks that I was here, I just sat in the other room listening to music. Wasn't doing anything else. Just listening to stuff I'd done, listening to old records I know, and CDs I know, anything. Just trying to reacquaint to the new room. I think both speaker systems are fantastic. I'd happily work on either, but they are very different to each other, and you've got to take the time to adjust from one to the other, I think.
Yeah. Absolutely, that absolutely makes sense. Thanks so much for that, Peter. So, when you was at Metropolis, so who were your mentors? Who taught you whilst you were at Metropolis? Who were you watching?
Well, I was originally for the first few months basically just shadowing John Davis and Maz Murad.
Yeah,
2 engineers with completely different philosophies about how they go about things as well, which is a really good thing, because it meant that I had basically 2 people who were unquestionably the top of their game, both telling me they were absolutely right about what they were doing. And then as you sort of carried on talking to the other engineers, they were all equally as adamant that what they were doing was right and what everyone else was doing was wrong. So it just meant that I had a whole load of different philosophies, and it's basically meant I can just pick and choose what I like from each of those, which I'm very fortunate to have done. There's only a couple of other engineers really who have been able to have that through Metropolis and see that breadth of engineers that they've got there and have had for so long.
Fantastic.
So then I spent, once I sort of progressed from shadowing like exclusively, and you sort of move on to being able to just do things. Spent a lot of time working under Stu Hawkes as well, doing his sort of alts and tweaks and that kind of thing on his days off and that kind of stuff. And again, the amount you learned from an engineer like him was just incredible. He probably taught me more than anyone else that less is more.
Yeah.
Essentially.
That's so good.
There was an amazing couple of years, just doing his, seeing what he does on stuff. Because I mean, the albums that were coming through at that time, I'm sure he's still doing equally high-profile stuff now. But the albums that were coming through at that time, it was like a couple of Ed Sheeran albums and Charlie XCX albums and that kind of thing. So sort of big sellers from really good mix engineers. So it means I'm getting to hear how mixes really should sound from the absolute pinnacle of the engineering world, and then what actually needs doing to that from a mastering perspective. Because I mean, again, I don't know if you've come up against this one yet, but the thing that I think in mastering that takes the most courage to do is the first time you send a track back without doing anything to it.
True. You're
because
absolutely
ultimately
right.
that's the goal. Is we really shouldn't have to do anything. The mix should just be great. And certain engineers, yeah, the mix comes in, you turn it up, and you send it back. But the first time you do that is pretty nerve-wracking.
Completely. I know that we spoke a couple of about 3-4 weeks ago to Barry Grint, another phenomenal master engineer like yourself, and Barry again is in the vinyl mastering world, and he said exactly the same thing: quality control. It's all about quality control, and like you said, another great engineer that I've interviewed as well, Tony Jack the Bear Mance, based out in Melbourne in Australia, and he said, if it's already great and it's already ready and done, then perfect. You can send it back, and then that's great. That's not a problem. And I think a couple of other engineers have said as well, it's like it's also not necessarily just your job, if I'm right in saying this, if you agree, as a mastering engineer, to be the person that changes anything, but it's just you could be the person at the end of the line that listens to it and goes, yeah, that's good, that's ready to go.
Like a validation stamp.
Yeah, exactly.
It can be, yeah. I mean, it depends how you look at mastering as well, because you got to remember the mastering is kind of two-part process. We're the last artistic stage, but we're also then the first technical stage.
Yeah.
So if you've got a collection of perfect mixes, then you're not necessarily coming to the mastering engineer to make it sound better. You're coming to the mastering engineer to produce what then needs to be distributed to the listening public.
Yeah.
Which again is also part of our job. We've got to get all the distribution formats correct. Everything's got to go to the correct person in the correct sample rate, bit depth, etc., etc., etc. Obviously, in days gone by, there was a lot more to that, because obviously you had to deliver, say, CD masters on a 1630 to the factory, and mastering engineers were literally the only people who had the equipment because it was so damn expensive.
Yeah.
But even today, there is still a part of our job is just getting those fades at the beginning ends of tracks right and the gaps right and how the album flows from one into the other. Getting that right is still separates a good record from a great one.
Completely agree with you. Absolutely agree with you. That's amazing. So tell us about, thanks so much for that, Peter. Tell us about some of the artists that you worked on whilst you, well, obviously we'll have a chat about the artists that you worked with at the bakery as well in a few minutes, but tell us about some of the artists that you've worked on at Metropolis whilst you were there.
Well, again, because it was in that learning phase, I suppose, through the majority of my time at Metropolis, it meant I got to work under those great engineers on the projects that they were doing. So, I mean, the two obviously that were biggest, the closest to my heart would be working with Ian Cooper on Oasis, which turned out to be his final project before he retired, which was remastering the first 3 Oasis albums, which they say are those fundamental albums in my music education, if you like. So yeah, when you're going through those tapes and you're talking to Owen Morris about how he was doing stuff, that's one of those pinch me moments. And the other one would have been with John Davis working for Led Zeppelin. He got the job to do the remastering of all the albums and the live releases that they've done over the years as well. So yeah, I got involved in that, doing all the sort of the restoration work mainly, which on those old projects is so time consuming. You're going through these sort of holy grail recordings, trying to decide whether a click that you're hearing is something that's a piece of crap on the tape, something that's happened in processing somewhere, or whether that's that click that all the fans really love, and if you remove it, you're going to be in so much trouble.
Oh, wow.
There's an awful lot of that going on. So there'd be an awful lot of sort of markers all over it saying, do we take this one out or not? And yes, sort of John and I sort of sat there looking at each other and go, yeah or no. I think we got it right because we never saw any real complaints. So I think we got it right.
Amazing. Well, I saw a picture of you. So Jimmy Page came into the studio.
He was in quite regularly. He was definitely interested in the project.
Yeah.
He'd come in quite regularly to sort of check on how things were going. I think it was the sort of final day of the main 9 album mastering. We all just sort of did photos with him because he's Jimmy Page.
Absolutely. I bet that's great though. But I suppose as well, like, did he actually say? Did he give you any feedback on the masters as well, like what he liked and what he didn't?
That'd probably be more conversations between he and John, because those were the detailed discussions there. But yeah, there were definitely things that were coming out. Sort of, yeah, I need to make sure the guitar's prominent here, or that scream is supposed to be really in the place there, that kind of thing. No, there was always, across each album, there'd always be something that he'd stand there and go, yeah, we need this.
Yeah.
He was definitely interested in what was going on and how it was sounding, and he certainly seemed impressed by it. He seemed happy because we got to do, part of that was we did the press launches with them because they wanted us to play it in all its glory. So they had us take the high-res files down with our converters. And we were doing them at what is now the Olympic Cinema in, oh God, where is it? My London geography is starting to fade now. What was the Olympic Studios?
That's cool. We'll come back to that.
Yeah, it's completely out of my head where it is.
Afterwards.
Yeah, West London anyway. Olympic Studios closed down a while ago, and it was bought and turned into a cinema.
Yeah.
But that was obviously where a lot of the first few albums were recorded. Yeah. So the idea was that we could have all the press in and play them the stuff in the room that it was actually recorded in, because the old Studio One is now the main auditorium there.
Right. Wow.
So they were great fun, and Jimmy was there on stage saying, "Oh, I love how these sound. These are brilliant. These are fantastic." I mean, obviously, yes, I suppose to an extent he has to do a lot of that because it's a press launch, but at the same time, it was it's pretty good to hear coming from someone like him. You get to talk to Chris Kimsey quite a lot about them as well, who obviously was the engineer on a lot of those albums. So he's got a room, because they didn't convert the whole building into a cinema. There's some of it still studios, and he's got one of those rooms, and so he was also getting involved in these playbacks as well, and being able to talk to him about, so what was it like walking into a room where John Bonham's playing and that kind of thing.
That's amazing.
He's a pretty awesome guy if you ever get the chance to speak to him.
Phenomenal. Absolutely. Oh man, it would be a dream. Absolutely. That was so cool. No, thanks so much for that piece. That's brilliant. So tell us as well, so obviously whilst you were at Metropolis, was that the transition from, in the I don't know how to put this, but like kind of in the box realm, or more like kind of hybrid realm, then into going full time into vinyl mastering? How did that transition come into purely vinyl?
No, I don't. It's not a case of I'm full time mastering, vinyl mastering. I still do. I do both. They're kind of two sides of the same coin, really. It was just, vinyl was just something that I got very interested in at Metropolis. I went into the mastering department not really thinking about it. It never been something that had crossed my mind really. And then the first time it comes up, and probably John said, "Right, today we're going to cut a record," and mine just goes like that. Like, whoa, we're doing what now? And it just becomes a rabbit hole, and you just keep going and tumbling down it. So I think I just became the one who was sort of most interested in it. A lot of the engineers there, because they've been doing it so long, were frankly sick of vinyl. They were the engineers who in the mid-90s were gleefully, happily throwing their lathes out the window saying, "We don't need this anymore, thank you, we've got CD, it's saving the world." So a lot of them were not interested in going back into cutting records when it started to become popular again. And obviously vinyl sales started to explode again around the time I was sort of having my formative years at Metropolis, if you like. So there just became a lot more opportunity to do it all of a sudden. Also at that time, the engineers who had sort of brought back the half-speed work that Metropolis had been doing had moved on. That was Miles Scholl, who ended up moving on to Abbey Road, and Crispin Murray, who's kind of just freelance, fixes everyone's lathes now. Those are the two guys who really sort of brought back the whole half-speed thing at Metropolis. Well, I suppose John Goldstraw as well, but he kind of works with Crispin as well on the sort of fixing everything aspect of it. They kind of brought back all the half-speed stuff and modified the lathe there so that it could be done again. No one had really been doing half-speed since 70s or the 80s. Let's say they'd moved on, and I was basically left as the one who was saying, "Hang on, I want to do this again." So kind of there was me and a couple of the techs. We kind of had to relearn it all again and work out what to do, and that got Tim Young, one of the sort of established engineers there, a bit more interested in it as well. And he started then sort of remembering things about how he'd done it back in the day as well, and suggesting things that we could try and make it work again. eventually we got half speed working again, so there's obviously engineers there still doing it now, and over here we exclusively cut half speed now. But again, going back to what you asked though, I think it was more. I was just the one who was there and willing to do it. I was sort of chomping at the bit to do all the vinyl work. So whenever there was sort of vinyl work floating around, oh, Pete will do it. It was kind of that attitude, I think. But that then obviously got me a lot of cool projects. I mean, I cut several gigs for the Rolling Stones, which is again another kind of really doing the Stones. So yeah, it became, I think vinyl just at that point became just more what I was doing because there was more of it, not because it was the thing I was sort of latching on. I've got to do this, but there was a lot of it floating around, and I was the one who was happy to do it, and I learned an awful lot out of that. Just and again in experimenting and trying this, trying that, and again talking to the other engineers who've been doing it for decades and saying, well, how does this work, and how about if you do this? And even at this point, you get again guys like Tim who would sometimes phone me in the middle of the day and say, have you ever tried cutting like this? I'll say, no, Tim, I would have asked you that question, but let's give it a go. So it's kind of reassuring that you never get to the bottom of this rabbit hole almost. You can just, it's a constant drive to make the record sound a bit better than it did last time.
Absolutely phenomenal.
But yeah, I still do a lot of just straight stereo and surround mastering as well. I surround mastering quite a lot at Metropolis as well, again, through shadowing Maz. He I assume still does a lot of the music DVDs that come out. Well, probably not DVDs anymore, but you know what I mean. So yeah, we got to do a lot of sort of stereo to 5.1 upsampling and straight 5.1 mastering, that kind of thing. It's great fun. I love doing that as well. It's a shame no one really does surround music anymore.
Well, it could come back. I suppose vinyl, kind of came back in a big way as well, to be honest. But
the problem with surround music though is that you need the environment. You need to be in the middle of 5 correctly set up speakers for it to sound right. And who's got a correctly set up stereo setup? Never mind 5.1 setup. So it's I think it's a lack of consumer interest. I don't think it's going to come back.
Yeah, absolutely. What is phenomenal though as well is, like, before we have a chat about the bakery and your amazing journey back to LA, is vinyl, the boom of vinyl as well, how it came back in a big way. And like you said, everyone, as I think you're a similar age to myself, that we all basically, our generation, we went out and bought CDs like everybody did, and then obviously then streaming then took over, and Napster then kind of kicked in the early noughties, and LimeWire and all those, those services, the illegal services, which obviously like Napster's now legit, but it's like, and now we're looking at Spotify and iTunes, but then all of a sudden everybody's buying vinyl, and it's people are starting to get excited by it, and they're actually enjoying having something tangible. And
I think that's the driving force behind it, is that it's listening to a record's more of an experience. It's not about just listening to the music. If you just want to listen to music, as you say, you can just hit play on Spotify and it will endlessly play music in the background until you tell it to stop. If you're going to listen to a record, you take the time, you're taking it out of the sleeve, you're putting it on the turntable, you're dropping the needle on it, you're going and sitting down, listening to it. At the end of the first side, you're getting up, you're taking the needle off, you're turning it over. You're more engaged in the whole experience. So I think that's a lot to do with it. It brings you closer to the music rather than something that's just happening. Yeah, you're more involved in making it happen. And it becomes the whole experience of listening to the music rather than just having it playing.
Absolutely agree with you. So I think, as a kid, I remember buying CDs and just literally, or, obviously now vinyl from time to time as well, but literally just walking into a shop and going, that's a cool album cover, I like the look of that, and actually just buying it because you like the look of it.
Obviously to a point you can still do that now. I mean, you're nudged and curated by your Spotifys and your Apple Musics to find the music that they want you to find, obviously. But there is still an element of, you can scroll down a whole list of album covers and see something. But what you can't do is then, like you say, is then take it home, put the CD in the tray, sit down and read the liner notes while you're listening to the album. Who worked on this? What were they thinking at the time? And let's look at the photos of them making the album and that kind of thing.
Absolutely, but there's just something. I think, Peter, it's just something to me. I don't know if you agree, but something more magical about that as well. You know, kind of now it's like phenomenal the fact that so many artists can get out there online, which is brilliant. But I suppose for one, it's really heard if you're a new artist to get heard above the noise. But there's just something magical about not really knowing about the bands and kind of making up your own stories. It's like kind of like Led Zeppelin, for example, those phenomenal albums. You know, back then, I suppose that people are kind of like trying to suss out who Led Zeppelin were, and they almost seemed like mystical characters that you know people didn't really kind of know about and just read about in magazines. But now you know everything about everyone.
Now you've got everyone's Instagram feed, and you can see what they had for dinner last night.
Exactly. Just like, oh, you know, it's like Jimmy Page had tofu last night. You know, it's like it's just that sort of, you know, that sort of thing now, isn't it? But it's, I don't know, it's just something I find vinyl. So my dad was actually really quick before I carry on. My dad was a DJ in the late 70s, and he literally, no word of a lie, he had a wall of 7-inch records that he used to DJ at parties and stuff. And as a kid, I never fully really appreciated that, but actually been able to actually kind of like, you know, even go around to my parents now, just kind of pick up a vinyl and go, who's this? What's that? And learn about all these like different bands and stuff. It's great. It's
I mean, yeah, that's totally how me and my dad used to do it back, again, going back as a kid. We'd go to record fairs on the weekend and junk shops, that kind of thing, just buy a pile of records. Like half of it would be because that's a funny name. Let's see what that's like, because it's 20p. Who cares? Doesn't matter. And then you spend the next weekend, we'd watch them all, make sure we can actually play them, and then sit down and actually go through them and work out what we've got and if anything's good.
Completely. That's so cool. So tell us, so obviously you've been at the bakery now for about 3 or 4 years. Am I right in saying that? Since
coming up on 3 this summer.
3 this summer. Amazing. So yeah, tell us about the journey from moving from Metropolis to move into the bakery where you're at now.
Well, yeah, as I said before, it's like Ocean Way. You spend a bit of time in the city, and it kind of felt like home. It's hard to explain how or why, but for some reason, LA, it just felt like where I was supposed to be. It sounds hippie and nonsense, but it just did. But obviously, you can't then just move out here. You've actually got to have a reason, and you've got to go through the whole immigration thing, which is a nightmare in itself.
Yeah, sure.
So obviously, I had to have a name and all that kind of thing, and at least have some sort of semblance within an industry for American immigration to say yes. I think when I got the offer to come out here, it wasn't really top of what we were planning. I mean, myself and the wife have been making trips out here because she's an actress, so she wants to come be out here as well. Works for her. We'd both long had this idea of moving out here. So we started doing a few holidays out here, and you start meeting people like you do, and you need to talk to so and so and so and so, and suddenly you know half the people out here who are sort of cutting records and mastering and that kind of thing. And it was on a trip where we actually came out entirely for the baseball. I'd become a massive LA Dodgers fan. And in 2017, they were in the World Series. So I came out here to go to a World Series game, and happened to get talking to Eric on that visit. It was one of those cases of, hey, you cut records, I cut records. Do you want to go for a beer?
Wow.
So, yeah, you got talking, and then again, it was probably just right place, right time. This place had sort of established itself by that point, and they were looking to just expand what was going on here, make more use of the facilities, and get more coming through. The way the bakery was set up was kind of initially was quite rushed because of the circumstances around it.
Okay.
Eric, the founder of the company, and Jet, the other engineer here, were working at the mastering lab under Doug Sachs, and obviously Doug Sachs passed away. So that essentially prompted the foundation of the bakery. So Doug's family essentially sold the lab and all its equipment and everything to some company who I think have still just got it sat in a warehouse somewhere, to be honest. So it left Eric and Jet with nowhere to work and desperately wanting to work. So they got lucky and set this place up. Eric also plays violin. He works on scores quite a lot, film scores. So he had done scoring here at Sony Pictures. It's one of the better sounding rooms in LA's here for scoring. So he knew a lot of the people here, and when he got talking, asking about, I need a room, I need to find somewhere to set up a mastering studio, they said, well, we've got this screening room that no one's using. Do you want it? So yeah, he said, yeah, and we moved into here. This is an incredible spot for a mastering room, really. It's almost like it was built for what we're using it for, but it was built 100 years ago. So we've got two rooms, essentially. We've got what was the projection booth where I'm sat now, which has become our vinyl cutting room. And it's become that because what I'm sat on is a massive 100-year-old block of concrete, because they needed to isolate the sound of a clackering 35mm projector from the people in the auditorium who were trying to watch the film. So that isolation works both ways. Now we need an isolated block to put the lathe on so that there's no vibrations get through to it while we're cutting. So it's sat on that same old concrete block. The auditorium room has then become our mastering room, and Eric said he hardly had to do any treatment to it when we moved in, and it just sounds fantastic. It's a great sounding space.
That's amazing. That's so incredible. So with the just with the history as well of where you are as well, it's just great. Absolutely phenomenal. I think, if I'm right in saying this, the first, going back, I mean, I've done quite a few interviews with pros like yourself now over the past few months, and Mayor Applebaum was the first engineer that I interviewed ever on PMFC, and I believe that Mayor actually came across to you guys at one point. And
he was here a couple of months ago. We were doing a Yes record with him.
Oh, great, amazing! How was that experience? Did you guys have fun?
Yeah, it's fine. Yeah, he mastered it. I don't believe he has a lathe, so when it came time to cutting, I can't remember if it was him or the label that asked for us, but he came down. Yeah, we had a good chat and cut the record. Everyone seemed happy with how it sounds.
Incredible. Brilliant, absolutely amazing. Yeah, so tell us about the mastering room then. So how is it set up? So what gear have you got in there, and the speakers that you've got in there?
Yeah, it very much follows on from the Mastering Lab's philosophies. So there's quite a lot different here to Metropolis, which was a great environment to come into, because with especially something like mastering, where there aren't really that many of us, until Bob Katz wrote it, there's no book on how
I've got it here. I've got it knocking around.
No, I've read Bob's book as well. Yeah, back when I was starting this, it's a great foundation. It does teach you an awful lot. But going back before that, there was no book. There was no here's how you master a record. So the education that I got in the UK from the likes of Stu, John, Tony, Ian, etc., is almost completely different from the education these guys got here from Doug. So working alongside Jet and Eric, it almost feels like I'm getting a second education now from Doug Sachs, which is, again, it's just another set of influences to come in and say, oh, that's a good idea, and pick up and use. So anyway, yeah, they followed a lot of the philosophies that they had at the lab, and one of the biggest things that kind of separates us from most other mastering studios in that way is that we have a completely open space between the listening position and the monitors. We don't have a console between us and the speakers, just completely open. We've got a computer off to the side, and then the console's behind us in the main room. So that obviously gives you the completely clear listening experience. There's no reflection, or very minimal reflection, far less than if you had that massive console in the way anyway.
Yeah.
And then most of that console is then designed by Eric as a sort of offshoot of what they were using at the mastering lab as well. So we've sort of got two analog signal paths, a tube one and a solid state one. So you get a very different tone between them. Both sound fantastic, and they're both right on different types of music. But again, it's all sort of following on from that philosophy. And again, we've got sort of an awful lot of isolated power going on. We've got huge power transformers all over the place to make sure equipment is all isolated. So again, one of the big things that I noticed coming here from Metropolis is the sort of the power isolation. At Metropolis, there's always a low level hiss in the speakers, always.
Yeah.
Here, there just isn't ever.
Wow.
Our signal path is just completely silent, which is entirely then down to that design and how it's all integrated with the power supplies and the isolation transformers to keep, say, things like the audio chain separated from sort of noisy computer switch mode power supplies and that kind of thing. That's made a world of difference in terms of how this place operates.
Absolutely incredible. So tell us, thanks so much for that, Peter. Tell us about some of the gear that's behind you as well. So I know that you're on a laptop.
Well, here I'm in the cutting room. So what's behind me here is our lathe.
I'll remove myself off the live for a sec so people can have a quick look. If that's cool. What, 1 sec?
Oh no, I've got bigger. So yeah, this is our lathe. It was originally owned by Stan Ricker, who was one of the pioneers of half speed. He used to do a lot of the half speed cutting for Mobile Fidelity, a lot of the audiophile stuff in the 70s and 80s. I suppose fortuitously for us, not for him, he died at a kind of similar time to Doug. So the lathe became available at a similar sort of time that we were building the studio. Or sorry, that Eric was building the studio. It's been quite highly modified since we got it. Essentially, normally with any of these Neumann lathes, you'd have a massive stack of sort of silver-fronted equipment next to it, and we've basically eliminated all of that. So we've got a very clean signal path on this lathe. We do all of our processing is in Pro Tools, and that then goes straight to the DAC, to the amp, to the head, and nothing else in between. So that means, we've got an incredibly simplified, shortened signal path compared to most other lathes, which gives us just a better sound. It means things are louder, punchier, everything you want in the sound is better because of it. And then we've enhanced that again by going half speed. Yeah, I'm sure other engineers have talked to you about this because it's quite popular in the UK now as well. We just do everything half speed now. We don't even offer a full speed service. And what that gives you is, again, more audio fidelity. You're giving the stylus more time to cut the groove, so you can put more detail into the groove. And the more detail that goes into the groove, the better the sound, because the physical detail in that groove is the audible detail that you then get back on playback.
Amazing. That's so cool. Absolutely amazing. So it's yeah, we were talking to thanks for showing us that, Peter. Yeah, I think Barry Grint, yeah, again, is talking about half speed, and yeah, I know a lot more mastering engineers that are in a vinyl world, vinyl mastering, are going down the half speed route. So what is the fundamental benefit to half speed? What is it that makes it fidelity? Is that it? Brilliant.
Yeah. Well, I say when we're cutting a record, we're cutting through an emphasis curve, similar to tape or a lot of the early digital formats were. Essentially, you're boosting an awful lot of the high frequencies, which is then obviously reversed on playback by your amp. So we're putting an awful lot of energy into those high frequencies, especially as people's expectations as to what records should sound like have got higher over the years. People now like the sound of full range records. We don't want to filter off lots of bass and lots of treble unnecessarily. So we're asking an awful lot of the cutting systems with the amount of top end that we're asking them to cut. So if we can reduce all of that, if that really difficult to cut 15K can suddenly become 7.5, what we're doing is we're just giving the stylus so much more time to be able to cut the groove.
Yeah.
And the more intricate that groove can be, the more detail you get on playback.
Amazing. Hence, as you said, high fidelity.
Yeah, exactly. So what you end up getting is essentially stereo image is usually better defined. You've got a clearer center point. Your top is usually clearer. With you can go a lot further before the distortion starts to kick in. That kind of thing. I tend to find I actually get a punchier, more defined bass. But I know a lot of cutting engineers who don't like half speed complain that you lose some of the bass, which I suppose technically would make sense because obviously you're shifting everything down, so some of that's going to fall off the end.
Yeah.
But to me, they always sound clearer and more defined in the bass. So for me, it's just win-win-win all over the place. The only downside is obviously how long it takes.
Absolutely. No, thanks so much for that. So I know with talking to other engineers and what I do myself as well, I'm based mainly in the box, and I do a little bit of hybrid from time to time. But when I know mastering for vinyl is a very different process to digital mastering. So tell us about how you would approach vinyl mastering compared to digital mastering, maybe in the realms of LUFS and dynamics. Like what measurements are you using when you do the mastering?
I'll be honest, there's not that much difference.
Okay.
If something sounds good, it sounds good across every format. There's exceptions to that, obviously. If you're doing something that is particularly vinyl unfriendly, like say putting masses of top end or sort of weird hard pan stereo panning bass effects, that kind of thing, that kind of stuff can occasionally cause problems. But generally speaking, if you've got something that sounds good, it's going to sound good on vinyl.
Yeah.
We do a lot of Bob Ludwig's cutting here because he likes our system. And I generally cut his masters completely flat, as in completely flat, unchanged in any way. Other things that come in for cutting and the processing that I might do might be to just literally make it sound better. Quite often you might get sort of, like, you get a lot of catalog work, again, going back to the sort of vinyl explosion, if you like. So you get a lot of old things that are coming back for recuts, things that were maybe never cut in the first place, stuff from the late 90s, early millennium that had never been cut is now coming in for cutting for the first time. So in those cases, I might be running a few processes, but more to just sort of bring it up to date, give it a bit sort of, if something was done around that sort of time, it's likely to be quite heavily compressed. So I might be able to do a few things here to sort of give some of that life back to it, in a way, because as you say, I am going to have to bring the level down from those commercial CD masters to cut it. So if I can make it move a little bit more at the same time, then that's always a good thing.
Great.
But generally speaking, if it's something I've mastered that I'm then going to cut, the only difference I might make, and again, it's genre dependent, so there's no hard and fast rule, is I might capture it without the limiter. But a lot of music relies on the limiter to sound right. If you're sort of doing a techno record or something like that, that's going back to the 90s, isn't it?
Yeah.
Doing something along those sort of like EDM or something like that.
Yeah.
It relies on that big pumpy sound that comes from the limiter. If you take the limiter off it to cut it, then it's not going to sound right. So it really is program dependent, but ultimately not a great deal, to be honest. And if there are any fixes, like I say, it's usually sort of just a bit of de-essing, and that's not so much to cope with what we can do here, but to cope with what everyone else can do on playback. We can cut records here. I mean, any cutting engineer can cut records that are completely unplayable with a normal stylus, because they just can't move fast enough to do what you're asking them to. So most of the de-essing work that we're doing is to compensate for playback, not to compensate for what we're cutting here as well.
That's really interesting. So what de-esser do you actually use? Is it on Sadie or is it on a third-party VST that you've got that you use?
It's usually one of two. It's usually the Fab filter, which I suppose most people say, or the Vice.
Yeah. Great. Yeah.
Soft tube Vice one. That's fantastic as well. Generally do that processing at at full speed, process the file, and then cut the file flat. Yeah. So that on its way out, all we're doing is really applying the RIA curve and that kind of thing to it.
Absolutely phenomenal. So I suppose that leads us neatly into maybe the digital realm as well. So as you mentioned, so you do digital mastering as well, if I'm right in saying that. So with what third-party plugins do you enjoy using when you're in the digital realm with compressors and EQs? What do you tend to use when you're on Sadie?
I suppose like most people, it's going to be a common set of tools, I think, that I'm going to list out here that most people go for. The Fab filter stuff is fantastic. The Q3, the L2, the DS, the MB. On those occasions, we need that kind of thing. I don't generally sort of compress music to actually compress it. Multi-band compressing is usually for like an effect or something, like bringing out kick drums, that kind of stuff. What else is it? Well, the Vice stuff, I'm leaning very heavily on those now. The soft tube Vice EQ compressor. Well, again, compressing is very rare. Generally, if I'm using that, it's kind of in MS mode to, again, fix something. So sort of rein in and out of control vocal or something like that.
Yeah.
What else is on there? Well, we've got the UAD stuff, but I'm trying to think what I actually use out of that. Shadow Hills every now and again for a bit of tone, but again, flat. Never actually, I don't think I've ever compressed through the Shadow Hills, even when I had the real one at Metropolis. I can't think off the top of my head. Oh, one that's come up recently is the Leapwing Center 1. I love that.
Interesting.
That's a fantastic little plugin. It doesn't do much, but what it does really well. It can just bring out. It's got a slider on there called Center Prominence, and it can just bring out sort of a slightly lost vocal and snare drum that's sat there and not just wants to poke through a bit more. It does that really well.
Brilliant. I know Bob Katz is a big Leapwing fan as well.
That's the only one I've really got into. I keep meaning to try out the other ones because I've heard a few people say that a load of their stuff is really good, and they're so friendly. They keep coming around and asking us what we want in the plugins and that kind of thing.
Brilliant.
They're really nice guys. I really need to try out the rest of their stuff more. I had a quick play with the multiband compressor. I forget what that's called now. But I found it wasn't really, because I say when I use a multiband compressor, I'm generally doing it as a sort of for bringing out kick drums, that kind of thing. A kick drum that's just slightly lost in the bass guitar.
Yeah,
it wasn't really doing what I wanted in the way that the Fab does. But it's quite a specific use of it, so it's trying to get some like a specific. It's not using a multiband compressor in the way it's designed to be used, really. So that's probably why it didn't quite work for what I was doing. But yeah, I'm sure it'll work on other things. I just need to get around to actually trying it. Again, I'm sure as most mastering engineers have said, we're very much creatures of habit. We don't change what we use very often. So we get used to using a set of tools, and it takes a while for a new one to sort of creep in.
Absolutely. It's so interesting that you say that because again, I suppose it's what you're used to. Like you said, how you said about the mastering guys, that have been in the industry for 30 years, they're used to certain converters, but I suppose master engineers now, like you said, with in the digital realm, are used to certain plugins, so it's quite interesting trying different things out. But I know that, so I use a lot of the Fab Filter stuff as well, and started to have a look at all the Leapwing stuff. But with Fab Pro MB for me, I'm very similar, so I bring it up in the sub and in the bass as well, so it's kind of like, and it just works. I don't know what it kind of does specifically.
Slow attack, fast release, just make it yeah.
Absolutely, it's just great. It's really, really handy and a helpful tool. But it's really interesting. We talked to a couple of engineers. I think Urko was one, phenomenal engineer, and he mentioned 10, 20 years ago you might not have looked at all these different plugins because you just wouldn't be able to get, I don't know if you agree, sometimes a decent sound. But now technology has advanced so much further. It's really interesting that you can do.
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely got to the point where, well, as I said to you earlier, I spend most of my time in the box now. We've got that great analog chain, and we've got some cool outboard to go with it as well. But more often than not, I just find I get a better sound staying digital, because it just especially with if you're going to go to Urko, that kind of stuff, that hip hop kind of stuff, especially. Yeah, it just maintains the punch and the transient so much better staying digital than going analog. Even with the best chains with headroom for days, it quite often just seems to lose something on the front end of like those kicks and snares that in certain genres of music, if you take those attacks off, you've killed it, you've done it. So I'm finding that the digital stuff is just maintains that, and now that the digital processing tools are good enough, like kind of alluding to what you were saying, that there doesn't become the reason to go analog anymore.
Absolutely, but analog
still on tape, obviously, in which case you're starting analog. But if it comes with digits, as most stuff does, keep it digits.
Completely. I suppose analog's fun. Analog's great fun to play around with new toys and new boxes, and there's some really crazy fun stuff out there. But yeah, I completely agree with what you're saying.
Yeah, and it also becomes a case of expense on something like that as well.
Very true.
Certain analog equipment, well, basically the stuff that most people want becomes prohibitively expensive.
Yeah.
I mean, if I was to add one piece of analog gear to what we've got here, I'd probably want that Sontec EQ.
Yeah.
I've got a pretty good plugin that I like using, but there's something about the real one, that the way it interacts, I don't know what it is, but it's got a, maybe it's just the one I was using that isn't the same as the one that was sampled for the plugin I'm using, but
Yeah.
it's just got a sound about it. So if I was going to add something, it'd be one of those. But then you've got to find someone who's prepared to sell one and prepared to sell it for less than about 10 grand.
Exactly.
So
it's crazy money.
It becomes prohibitively out the question.
Completely agree. And thanks so much for that, Peter. Do you tend to use, I'm guessing if you're going for as clean a signal as possible, do you from time to time, maybe for coloration, use any saturation at all, or did you actually?
No, and what I was saying there is it's more a case of I don't want the software or the hardware or whatever to do something by default, as it were.
Yeah.
The ideal is the straight piece of wire from source to destination. And the more you have to introduce to that is essentially, all you're doing is essentially degrading the signal, aren't you? So
yes,
so it's not a case of necessarily keeping it clean, but it's more a case of only imparting onto it what I actually want to impart onto it.
Yeah.
So if you've got that straight piece of wire and it needs that warmth or something, it wants a Fairchild, or for want of a better thing, just that big tubey sound.
Yeah.
Then if you drop that in and it adds that, then great. But I don't want it to be there by default, and I'm having to work against it almost if it's doing something I don't want it to do.
Absolutely.
So, that again goes back to Sadie as well. I think anyone else who uses Sadie will probably say the same, is we kind of use it because it doesn't do what you don't ask it to do.
Yeah, completely.
If you just play a file in Sadie, it literally just plays it, whereas you pull a file into Pro Tools, it's already increased the bit depth by sometimes orders of magnitude, doesn't it, depending on what it came in at. Whereas if I give Sadie a 16 file, it's going to play it at 16-bit.
Yeah, definitely. That completely makes sense in, why it would do that. And actually, another question before I forget as well, with headphones as well, what do you tend to use? Any headphones when you're in the studio, or is it just speakers? Is that how you approach it?
I've never really got on with working on headphones. I just doesn't work with me. I don't know. Speakers.
Yeah, completely. And if it works for you, it's fantastic. Do you tend to actually listen to much music outside of the studio as well, or do you tend to try and give your ears a rest? Because bearing in mind, I suppose you're doing this, how many hours a day, but do you still go home and listen to music, or do you tend to? So
it's going to really depend, I think. I mean, if I've spent a day just sitting here cutting records, then again, especially if I'm literally just cutting the lacquers that are going off for production, then I'm not exactly listening to music. It's rolling through at half speed, remember? So it's just you basically turn it down so you can just about hear it still coming through, and keep checking everything's going as it's supposed to be going. So in those situations, sure, go and put a record on or listen to something, whatever. If I've just finished like a day of doing an album that never seemed to end or something like that, then you go home and sit in a quiet room.
Yeah, absolutely. What music do you enjoy for fun? What bands are you listening to at the minute?
It's all followed on from what I was listening to as a kid. It really has. I mean, I suppose anytime you work with music, it's obviously going to broaden. But so anything that's basically comes off Beatles, Floyd, Oasis, those kind of influence trees that go off from that. Yeah, all that kind of stuff.
Oh, absolutely incredible.
I don't. It's depressing, but I suppose I should do more. But I don't find myself listening to too much new music that often.
Okay,
that probably should do more.
Makes sense. Absolutely makes sense. But with you said you mentioned you've been now at the bakery for almost 3 years. What have been some of the highlights to you so far with some of the projects that you've worked on at the bakery?
Oh man, it's all because COVID has made these kind of questions very difficult to answer.
Fair enough.
Everything kind of blurs, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Oh God, what we had that was good. Weezer were in there. That was pretty cool.
Oh, amazing.
Eric mastered 2 albums for those, and I cut them. We had we did a record for the Carpenters, which was pretty amazing as well.
Wow.
Which was it was like a new one of these new orchestral ones. So they sort of gone and got the multi-tracks and extracted all of Karen's vocals and then put a new orchestral recording onto it. God, it just sounded amazing, especially that voice. Yeah. God, what else has come through? I can't even think. Been doing quite a lot of rap stuff over here. I suppose that kind of makes sense. I suppose being here, which has been pretty cool. Although most of it's been coming from the East Coast. I think did Goldlink and Cousin Steers, who are both sort of East Coast. So that's been good fun. That's been kind of getting to work into a new genre almost. I've not done a huge amount of hip hop really.
Great.
Pop and rock, but I hadn't really done that much hip hop, and then I started getting a few bits of it, and it's pretty good fun to do because it's so exacting. It's got to be of a certain it's got to sound a certain way, but it's also got to be really clean and clear. So it kind of does push you as an engineer. So it's been quite good fun doing that.
Amazing. I know you sent me a Goldlink track that you've worked on, and it sounds awesome. It sounds great. And again, like you said, I'm guessing a very different dynamic to the other stuff, from going from, the Carpenters and Weezer to then doing all like the Goldlink stuff. This is
I think one of the best things about mastering as the sort of as a specialty. You're a mix engineer. Mix engineers seem to very much genre specialize, and that makes sense because you've really got to get deep into how that genre works. Whereas mastering, we get to experience a whole lot more. Certainly stops you getting bored. Like I say, you're doing the Carpenters one week and then sort of in your face hip hop the next week. It's good.
Keeps it fun and diverse. Yeah,
totally, yeah.
It's amazing. Love that. Absolutely love that. So cool. So before we go, so what are your plans really then for the future? So what are you looking to do? So are you looking to kind of expand the bakery? Are you? Is that the plan, or so? What's next?
Me personally, stay put. We've got a good thing going here, as far as I can tell.
Completely, it's amazing.
In terms of quite a few ways, because we're very rare in that we've got 3 engineers here, all under the age of 40, which there's not many sort of multi-engineer houses that are as young as us. It kind of feels weird saying young when like 40 is rapidly approaching. But,
you me both.
But yeah, relatively young. So yeah, I mean, this feels like the kind of place where the 3 of us could happily work for the next 30 years until we retire.
Yeah, that's amazing. I love that.
We've got a great little team. We're all sort of really good engineers, so we're all sort of pushing each other. There's no sort of what's the word? There's no kind of weak link almost, if you like. There's no. That doesn't sound. That's the wrong way of putting it as well. But we're all sort of moving in the right direction, if you like. We're all sort of pushing forwards, and we're all kind of working at a very similar level, I feel. And again, like I say, we're all in our late 30s, so it feels like we're in a position where we can make the bakery a good place to be for 30 years.
Absolutely. It's so cool as well. I just love the fact that you've, converted such an old building into this phenomenal space as well. It's great.
It's pretty cool being down here as well, because we're surrounded by the screening rooms that are still screening rooms.
Yeah.
So we had the one image that is going to stick in my mind for a long time is The Rock as an elf walking up and down the corridor outside, going into different screenings.
Wow.
Okay.
That's mad.
You get to see some cool stuff, and every now and again the projectionists will say, "Hey, do you want to come and see this?" Some cool previews of things that aren't out yet, which is kind of fun.
That's amazing. It's so great though. So over the last few weeks, we've had some really fun conversations, with yourself, with engineers, with funny stories. But Mark Dodson was one that kind of stuck out for me, just telling us a story about Keith Moon, and it was apparently a clown walked into the studio, and Keith Moon just ran out from behind his drum kit and started beating this clown up. It turned out to be one of his friends. But it's like, what the heck? You know, there's just these crazy stories, but you know,
He
it's
probably
great.
didn't know what the hell was going on.
Absolutely. Oh, amazing. But you know what? I will ask you this very last question. Do you want Oasis, been a big Oasis fan, do you want Oasis to get back together, or do you just want them just to leave it and just have the legacy as it is and be done with it, you know?
I don't know. I don't really. To be honest, I don't know. I've kind of lost interest in their output these days anyway. It seems a bit weird. I really enjoyed Noel's first 2 solo albums. I thought they were great. And then the third one just seems to fall off a cliff for me. And then all these EPs and things he's been putting out since, I haven't been great to my ears anyway.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'd almost, let's put it this way, if they did, I'm almost certainly going. That's what, no.
Yeah, you and me both. Absolutely amazing. Phenomenal. Anything you want to leave us with today, Peter?
I have no idea.
No. Very honest. Amazing. But Peter, feel free to hang after the interview for a couple of minutes as well. But really appreciate you joining us and your time today. But it's been so fun just learning about your journey, and as well learning about mastering and your process, and as well about vinyl mastering and half speed as well. It's great. So but anyone, thanks so much, man. I really appreciate it. And I'm sure if anyone's got any questions about mastering, I'm guessing they could drop you a message at the bakery directly onto the website. Yeah,
of course, yeah.
Phenomenal. Well, thanks so much. Really appreciate your time. And thanks everyone for joining who's watched us live today. Feel free to check out our community, which is facebook.com/groups/produce, mix, fix and conquer. And absolutely check out the Bakery Studio on Google as well. It is such a great space that Peter and the gang have got there. It's brilliant.
We've done all right. We got lucky. It's not
Absolutely. But thanks again, Peter. Really appreciate your time today, man.
Very welcome.